Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome also from me for this Friday's webinar. Thank you very much for joining or joining again. It's lovely to see a few names I already know, so hello there again, and a big hello to everybody who has not joined our webinars yet. It's lovely to have you here. I hope you can all hear me okay. The sound is good. So if you can, just a thumbs up in the chat would be appreciated, just to make sure you can hear me okay. Lots of people typing, so I hope for a lot of yeses. Yes, fine, everything's cool. Okay, so let's get started then. Without further ado, let's do some text squeezing, how to get students excited about reading. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to share a secret with you. If you're anything like me, sometimes when I have to step in for a colleague, because when I do not do webinars for Cornelius, what I do is what you do, I teach for a language institute, communications institute based in Bielefeld. So sometimes when I don't have enough time to prepare something or when I have to step in for a colleague, what I do is I look for a nice text that I find interesting, and then I email it to the students and I ask them to read it and to prepare it, and then we'll dive into the discussion next session, and that's that. Frankly speaking, this is probably not ideal, at least that's what I found out recently, so I thought I'd share some of my experience with you, and maybe I can pick your brains and how you do with text and how we can squeeze text better than just send them to students and dive into a discussion, which is nice, of course, but maybe there is something more than we can do about that. So let's see. Let's have a look at our agenda and what we are going to do today. The agenda looks like this. I've prepared 3 topics: text as objects, reading texts. That's a bit of a theory thing, so that'll take us 3 to 4 minutes if that's okay with you. And then we'll dive into the practical side of things. So text squeezing and 8 things I do with text, and I'm sure there is a lot more than I can do with them. So I'd be happy if you shared everything that you do with text in the chat so that I can learn from you and do the next thing and the better thing in my next session. So that would be wonderful if you did that. So please feel free to share everything you know and you do with text in the chat, and we'll share together what we can do with text, what is good about reading, what doesn't work well, good things, tips and tricks, everything that might be useful. Feel free to share it. But before we do that, I'd like to share with you some of the things I found out by reading literature by people far cleverer than me, and you will find all the literature that I've based this webinar on in the handout that I've referred to at the end of the webinar. So there's no need to jot anything down. Everything's set in the handout. So without further ado, let's have a look as texts as objects. Okay, what do I mean by that? A text as an object. Frankly speaking, I've never really been thinking about a text as an object. I thought as a text, something that my students can read, that we can discuss about, that gives us interesting information, something enticing, to dive into a heated debate about something, that sort of thing. But to look at a text as an object, frankly speaking, that's never come to my mind until I read something interesting, which I'd like to share with you now. So how about we looked at a text as a linguistic object. Now, what does that mean, a linguistic object? Now, you might say, well, of course, a text is a linguistic object, consists of words, doesn't it? So what I was thinking was that a text can be a linguistic object if you look at it from a student's point of view or from a teacher's point of view as something that you can search for lexical sets, for example, or grammar patterns. So you look at the text and you ask your students, okay, what words can you find, that are related to this and that topics? Can you see tenses? What prepositions can you find there? Prefixes, whatever comes to mind. So you just look at the text as a linguistic object, as a conglomerate consisting of words. Okay, that's that. Then what about a text as a vehicle for information? Okay, well, that seemed clear to me when I read that. Sure, that's what I do when I look at text and I decide, yeah, this is something that my students could be interested in, or that is something that I'm interested in, and therefore like to share with my students. I say, okay, this text is a vehicle for information. Easy. I can come up with tasks like ask students to answer comprehension questions, for example, or talk about what is new to them in the text. Did they know about the new supply chain law, or did they know about pubs in England or whatever? So that sort of information that I want to discuss with them in the text. So that's how I use texts a lot. There is more than that. There is a third thing that text might be used for. Text as a springboard for production. Okay, never been thinking about it that way. Text as a springboard for production. Okay, what might that mean? Production, of course, on the student side, they could, for example, produce further reading. They could produce text, write and discuss about a text. They could turn a text into a different text or that sort of thing. They could write an essay about a text, which would be a pretty academic thing to do. So springboard for production might mean lots of things that students can do with the text. Okay, so far so good. I thought, okay, I understand what is meant by that. Now, how can I use these different types of text, so to say, or these different concepts of what a text might be in class? When would it be good to use or to look at a text as a linguistic object? And when would it be good to look at it as a vehicle for information? And what kind of text might be good for as a springboard for production? And what level would work best with what kind of text concept? Would a springboard for production be good for an A1 class? Would a linguistic object kind of concept be good for a B2 class? I wasn't sure, so I gave it a try, and I'd like to share my findings with you. But before we do that, let's have one more theoretical thing. Let's discuss one more theoretical thing, namely, what exactly is the reading of the text in class? I don't know how you deal with that. Do you ask your students, especially when teaching online, do you ask them to read texts out loud? Could you share in the chat how you do that? I'd be interested in picking your brains. Yes, Karen says yes, she does that. Helen sometimes. Richard also out loud. Peter, yes. Okay, so Bettina says no. Aha, I have one no. Lots of yeses, yes, 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 yes. In turns, okay, it's what Jennifer says. Not always, Antonietta, okay, sometimes. So we'll have one no, two no's. Nicole also says no. Aha, okay. Can the two no's of you, could Jonas also no? Could you quickly tell us what else you do if you do not read them in class or ask students to read out loud? Maybe the ones that type no could quickly give us some insight in what you do instead. Read for themselves is what Nicole does. Okay. Bettina is also typing. I think she was also one of the knowers. Jonas, students read in class but not out loud. Aha, okay. Bettina says they read it on their own. Ah, that's a very interesting point. Super. Thanks for sharing that, because that is something that I've been thinking about. How best to deal with text, be they short or long, in class when I have, let's say, 6 students on tiles, on camera nowadays, instead of having them in a class. Do they read on their own? Should they be reading that on their own at an A1 level, at a C1, at a B2 level? How best to deal with it? From the theoretical point of view, what I found out and what I've learned from my reading was that there are, of course, different approaches. A couple of years ago, lots of us, I'm sure, who started teaching a couple of years ago, like me, still know the translation approach. There are students that love having everything translated into their mother tongue. Elderly students in particular, at least that was my experience, like really knowing what the English words mean, and they love to go through the text translating everything word for word. Others might say, translation approach, I don't know, when reading English only. So if there is something you don't know, try to either paraphrase it or ask another student to explain if they know what the word might mean in English. And then there is the multilingual approach when reading. So things that you don't know might have to be either translated or explained to somebody whose first language is not German, but might be Polish, or I've got lots of students from Kazakhstan, for example, in my class, so their first language is not German, but Kazakh. And the translation approach now in today's globalized world is not as easy as it used to be when we took it for granted that our text that we were reading would have to be translated into from English into German. So you might have to go for the multilingual approach. If you'd say, no, that's not my kind of thing, and also my students don't want a translation really, because we feel that the immersion thing is the thing that we do, we want an English-only environment in our class, then maybe you go for something that is nowadays called global English or global reading. What does that mean? I don't know whether you know it by that term. Easy English very much goes with that term when supporting reading that says you need to be able to read a text without knowing each and every word, because that is what real life will look like. You know, you walk through the town of wherever, Chicago, if you go on, I don't know, on a business trip, for example, or if you're there for a holiday, and you'd be confronted with lots of text, and you will not have the chance, you know, to go through each and every word and look it up in the dictionary. No, you will have to be able to scan the text and look for words that you will probably find absolutely necessary to look up, because otherwise you'll not be able to understand what the text is about. And there might be others who would say, oh, come on, no risk, no fun, you know, I won't look that one up. I know what the text means. I know the overall message. I get it. I get the contents. Global reading. This is something that my business students, for example, need to practice, and very often practice. They need to be able to very quickly scan reports, instructional texts, spreadsheets, that sort of information, to get the overall message as quickly as possible. Global reading. Okay, now does that work for all levels? Can an A1 group do global reading? A B2 group? Yeah, that seems to be likely, but an A1 group? Well, and then how to do it? Some of you said in class, no, we don't read texts together. Others said, yes, we read them together. Some of you said, I'll ask my students to read it out loud. So basically, there are different approaches, which you could call synchronous and asynchronous. And if you've been in other webinars of mine, you probably know what to expect now, namely a big hooray for asynchronous learning. I like asynchronous learning. What does that mean? Asynchronous basically means you'll allow the students to read the text at their own pace, their own speed. You allow them to look up the words that they find necessary to look up, or to skip that they don't want to look up. They read it either at home, before class, maybe in class if you decide you want to take the time, no problem. You ask them to do it at their own pace, in their own time. Why do I like that? Because I tend to think that the idea of synchronous learning is something that does not reflect what is happening in real life, you know. We all like that idea of students learning synchronously, of everybody being at the same level, everybody understanding what the text is about, everybody knowing how to pronounce the words, knowing the meaning of the lexis that is being presented. But in real life, my experience is that there's often students say, I didn't get that word in the first line. How do you pronounce that again? Actually, I don't get the last sentence at all. So this idea of synchronous learning when reading text and everybody understanding at the same time what's going on, the overall context, I tend to think this is not realistic. This is why I like handing text to students before class, either via email, or if they're in a course book, so much the better. I could simply ask them to read the text on page so-and-so as in Easy English, or read it in their ebooks or wherever. So asynchronous learning is what I'll do a lot. So I'll go with Nicole, for example, who said, and I think Bettina also said, no, we don't read it in class. We read it probably outside class. So much for reading and how it can be done and the different approaches that there are. So we've covered 5 things up to now. We talked about the concept of a text. So a text as a linguistic object, the text as a vehicle for information, and the text as a springboard for production, whatever kind of production. And we had a look at reading. So how can a text be read, with or without translation, multilingual translation, yes or no? Should we go for the global reading approach? So everybody reads the text and tries to get the overall message and decide for him or herself which words to look up. All these things are out there and should, of course, be adapted depending on what level you teach and the needs of your students, obviously. So far so good. So that's what I learned from reading all the literatures. Now, thing is, what to do in class and how to adapt that. And before we dive into this, practical session, looking at different texts and what one should or could or might be able to do with it, I'd like to draw a short poll onto the screen, asking for your experiences and your ideas. Maybe Özlem could push the poll into the presenters area. Ta-da, there it goes. I'd like you to tell us how you feel about using text in class. You've got 5 statements here. Please click as many as you like. And let's see what the outcome is. Oh wow, there's a lot of movement going on. Very nice. Wow, we are moving towards 53, 52, 50%. Students quite enjoy reading and discussing text in class. Woo, okay. And we'll have students prefer videos to text, 39%, 37% so far. 40% now. Yes, the videoers, go, go, go. I'm all for videos when it comes to that, but I'm also all for texts. Students quite enjoy reading and discussing text in class, 62%. Okay, I stand corrected, because if this should be true for most classes, like students quite enjoy reading and discussing text in class, 64% of you say that, then maybe I should move away from my idea of asynchronous reading. Maybe then I should go for reading in class and reading together. Maybe I should give students time in class to read and then discuss the text together instead of handing it out as a prep task or homework, as it used to be called, whatever word you might use. So that is a very interesting outcome for me. I wouldn't have expected that. Very interesting indeed. Then we'll have 47% saying students prefer video to texts. 47%. So basically every second student, you'd say. 48 now. Wow, now we're back to 47. Okay, let's say almost every second student prefers videos to texts. That is something I see very much reflected in my engineering classes, or classes with younger students, being university students, for example, who often tell me, isn't there a YouTube video about that? Do I really need to read that report, or that sort of thing? But then on the other hand, isn't that statement, students prefer videos to text, isn't that something that should trigger us into making text exciting for students even more so? Because I'm absolutely convinced there is no way around reading text. Videos, as nice as they might be, but there will be text to read also in the future. So Karen is just saying, I use both video and text. Absolutely, I'll go with that as well. So I'm absolutely sure that we will not be able to ever substitute all videos or text by videos. Although every second student might say, isn't there a nice video to go with that? Very interesting outcome. 14% saying students prefer non-fiction to fiction. So I'll go with that as well, most of my students, but that of course depends on what the type of students you teach, would rather read something about technical innovations or things that are cooking, something political, instead of reading literature, so poems, short stories or whatever, but that very much depends on the class. So Easy English has a very nice short story section to come as supplementary material in the Page Player app, which students that are not so business related like a lot, or business interested like a lot. So that very much depends on students' needs. So thanks a lot for sharing that, especially the fact that reading text in class is so popular. So that was a very interesting outcome for me. Right, so we can move the poll, if that's okay with you. We can move it out of, thank you, Özlem, out of the screen again. So let's have a look then. If, as you are saying, most students or many students like reading and working on text in class, then let's dive into the practical side of things, and have a look at what one can do with text. I've based this on a few examples from Easy English A1.1, Easy English Upgrade, I should say, A1.1. However, what I'll be talking about, I hope, will also work for text that you might be working on or that you might be dealing with. So look at these, please, just as exemplary texts. So there we go. Let's have a look at this thing as a text. This is obviously a menu. It's from A1.1. It's from the early chapters, page 46, so very low level. And it's a text in that it is text. Obviously, it's not a text in that it has long sentences, connectors, difficult grammar, presentation, that sort of thing. But it is a text. Now, what to do with this? Okay, we'll have words there that lend themselves very nicely to a discussion about what kind of English words we have in our language, whatever our language may be, because we might be a multilingual class when it comes to mother tongue speakers. So what I suggest one might do with a text like this is, I go for this first as a linguistic object. This text to me first is a linguistic object. We're at an A1 level probably, so why not use this and turn it into a game and ask students to pick a word from this menu. Everybody spells it to themselves first, practicing the alphabet, and then I ask them to spell a word that they see in this menu to the others, and the others have to guess it or to say it as quickly as possible, as quickly as they understand what the other person's spelling. This way we have the words practiced, plus we get the pronunciation. We get different pronunciations depending on what kind of variety or accent the speakers have in my class. I could correct them or tweak their pronunciation a little bit, plus we practice the spelling. So this way we'll look at it as a linguistic object. At an A1 level, I would not look at it as a vehicle for information. I would not say, do you like coffee to go? Do you think it's too expensive? How often do you go to whatever public coffee to go chain in your town? Because that might not be the language that they'd be able to handle, because at that level they're not able to agree or disagree fluently or to discuss issues like these, or issues or topics like these. So I'd say, okay, let's first go for the text as a linguistic object and look at the words as such, like in a spelling game. But one could, of course, do other things. Text as a linguistic object, exactly. Manal was just, saying that in the checks. TLO, it's from the former slide. Sorry, Helen, I should have mentioned that again. So what else can one do? One could also look at the text, even at an A1 level, as a TSP, as text as a springboard for production. Now, how so? Well, we could ask students to come up with more words that they might want to put into the menu. And I'm sure they'd be able to come up with English words that they know, that, as words that are used in German, for example, or easy words that are more or less international that they can put into the menu, or maybe something that they have fun translating, like Franzbrötchen, if they come from Hamburg, for example. So they might want to put that into the menu, maybe. And if it can't be translated, I'm sure then, you have fun looking it up as a picture on Google, or finding a recipe or whatever. So the main thing being, even easy stuff can be used as a springboard for production. Now, why is that important? I found that as soon as you enable or empower students, even at a lower level, to expand a text, to add their own ideas, their own, and here comes a pedagogical term, their own pre-existing knowledge, so basically what they already know from their outside world, to the text is no longer just a linguistic object, just words to be learned, lexis to be practiced. It is something that they can incorporate into their own world. And that is, I feel, or that's my experience, that is what makes reading exciting. It gets exciting when I find, I can link it somehow to what I already know, what I find interesting, what I find fascinating, or what I dislike. It doesn't always have to be the likes only, could also be the dislikes. And as you can see, there is already a very small exercise here. Bestellen Sie ein Getränk und etwas zu essen von der Karte, which is already an exercise that was added in Easy English to practice the language that was practiced in the unit before the menu was given as a springboard for further production. So at this level, I suggest looking at a text as a linguistic object and then using it as much as we already can at that level as a springboard for further production. for more language, as long as it doesn't get too complicated. So those are two things I would do with easy texts. Okay, now this is a text in that it is a collection of words. Let's move on to something a bit more complicated. Let's have a look at something like this. This is also from Easy English. As you'll be able to see, it's a little later in the unit. But now we have whole sentences. There is the simple present used in the sentences. Sentences getting a little longer. We'll have more complicated sentence structure. It's what was in former times simply called a Landeskunde text. And as you can see on the left-hand side, there is this greenish icon which says Übersetzung. So should you have students which go with the translation approach, as we discussed at the beginning in our theory part, then you could refer them to the page player app, where they'll find the exact translation of the text, and they could read the translation maybe asynchronously at home, just to be on the safe side, and then read and listen along, or listen and read along, depends which order you prefer, with this text. Okay, it's about telephoning. Good. So what to do with a text like this? I might go with what you've suggested. Many of you said in the chat before, I'll ask my students to read the text out loud, either in turns or maybe there is a volunteer who likes to read it out. I'm fine with that if students want that. My experience, though, is, I don't know whether that corresponds to your experience. Let's see. My experience is that very often when I ask students to read something out loud, they read it out loud, and then what they tell me is, hang on a sec, I'll quickly have to read that again. I didn't get it because I had to read. Why is that? That is because our brain can only take in that many words while reading. In our mother tongue, we skip every third to fourth word because our brain is able to concoct the meaning of the words, the glue between the words, so to say, automatically, because we have pre-existing knowledge in our head about our language. When we're reading a foreign language, this becomes an issue. We'll have to focus on the words, on new lexis, on pronunciation, on the word order itself. We'll have to have an eye on when the sentence ends, on our pitch and melody, and so on and so forth. And all this becomes rather complicated. So this is why, if there is a text that is not meant to be read out loud, like a poem, for example, talking about nonfiction, I'd say if students want it, okay, nothing to be said against it. However, I usually don't ask my students to read out loud. I'd rather ask them to listen along while either I read it out loud or I play the audio to them for that reason, because it might stretch their capacity too far. But as I said, if your students are fine with it and if they say, yes, this is what we want, this is what we're used to from school, no problem with that. So what I sometimes do with texts like these, so these kind of Landeskunde texts, I look at it, first of all, as a vehicle for information. Why not as a linguistic object first? Because there is this red telephone box there. It has the telephoning headline, and some of you already read in the chat, you asked students to think about what might be in the text by looking at the headline first, so super thing to do. So I look at it as a vehicle for information because it lends itself very nicely to this because of the picture and the headline. So I would ask maybe comprehension questions related to the text. Like how many boxes, telephone boxes are there in the different countries mentioned in the text, how many countries are mentioned in the text, that sort of thing. And then I might go on moving towards people's own experience. Like, that question is not answered, Helen just said, sorry about that. You get the hang of it. So I would obviously ask a question that could be answered by looking at the text. So, and then I would, after asking comprehension questions, I would move on to questions that would elicit knowledge of the students and related to their own experiences, like are there telephone boxes in your area? Now, at this level, I feel, needs to be careful with the questions you ask. I myself, I'm afraid, I tend to ask questions that very often stretch students' not imagination, but language capacities too far. So I often ask questions because I'm really interested in their experiences, and I sometimes forget that they don't have the language capacity yet to answer these questions. So if you look at the text as a vehicle for information and you want to get students on board telling you something about the information in the text, bear in mind that at this level, they're only able to use simple present sentences. They may or may not be able to handle negative sentences. They are able to say, I like, I don't like, or there is, there aren't, at that level. However, a question like, are there telephone boxes in your area, would surely work, because the answers would be yes, there are, no, there aren't. Okay. Then maybe you'd ask a question like, okay, are there many telephone boxes? No, there aren't. Why not? There are not many telephone boxes because many people use a smartphone, for example, or use a mobile phone. And that'll take you to another aspect in the text. And here we could go back looking at the text as a linguistic object, because the text also talks about false friends, the word handy. So off we go and look at the text as a linguistic object. In the last section, you'll find this bit about, not saying handy, but saying mobile phone or cell phone or smartphone, depends on what you'd like to choose. So why not ask students about other English words they know in their language? So in today's time, of course, the word home office comes to mind, which is kind of false friend. But then there are other words like body bag, or I don't know, words like public viewing, and other words that surely come to mind. I know you know many more than body bag, exactly, Richard. Mentioning that in the chat. Thank you. And many others that come to mind. So I'm sure students will come up with words that they know in English, in their language. Some of them may be correct. Some of them may be incorrect or not used in English, so much the better, so there's room for discussion. Again, it's pre-existing knowledge. Students expand knowledge, about the text that is presented there. So I wait for Manal typing, because she may come up with more words. And Romi's typing as well, so let's see whether anybody comes up with more false friends. Beamer, thank you, Mechthild. Yes, exactly. For example, yes, the infamous Beamer, exactly. Yes, yes. Eventually, finally, actually, all this sort of thing. Exactly. So that is something that we could probably do at every level, I suppose. But even at a lower level, old timer, thank you very much. Yes, download them. Yes. Yeah. So at one level ever, the main idea behind this, when looking at the text as a linguistic object, is to not only focus on what students do not know yet, but to focus on the world of information, the world of new words and language that is around there. And some of that they may already know, others they may not know, but it should be fascinating to find out. To focus on grammar patterns only, like have a look at the prepositions, have a look at the tenses, is something that I would say I would not do with a text. I would do that in an exercise, in a follow-up exercise. However, my experience is that that is something that I would do at a higher level. Why? Because I'd like to enable students at an A1 and an A2 level. I would like to enable them to read as quickly as possible, to give them the feeling that they can handle a text. And isn't that a kind of wow or ta-da moment at an A1 level, when you feel, wow, you're able to read a text about telephoning and telephone boxes in England after just a few weeks of training. And that is, I think, what should be in the focus of looking at the text as a linguistic object at that level. Mobbing and wellness. Thank you, Christy. I'm sure there's tons of others. I need to save the chat to be able to benefit from one of the lists you've come up with here. So next one. So what about this one? So for up to now, we've had 4 different ideas of how to deal with texts. So we're moving to a different type of text here. This is a short email, again in Easy English Upgrade A1.1, a little later. And this is text by Leon, written to Layla, and he's writing about his visit to Liverpool. So really easy text to read, no complicated grammar, There's also no complicated grammar or new grammar presented here in the unit to the students. Instead, we are presenting new information like Dear Layla and best wishes, so something that people might or might not want to use in emails when writing emails to each other. So what to do with a text like this? Again, we could of course ask students to read it out loud because, and here I'm moving away from my formal thesis that I would not ask students to read text out loud. Why this one? Because emails, postcards, maybe even touristy information is very often written to be read out loud. An email is usually in a kind of chatty language that you might also find when texting or sending WhatsApp messages or even talking on the phone to somebody. It's usually, at least when presenting such everyday information, is usually not complicated language like a Landeskunde text or something like that. That is not meant to be read out loud. This is a text that I could imagine my students would want to read out loud because it's short sentences, it's language, it's sentence structure that they would also use when speaking. So yeah, I'll go with that and say, why not read it out loud if you want to. There is also the audio icon, again, like with every text in Easy English upgrade, so they can also read and listen along, or read and listen along and read along and listen, whichever way around you prefer. What else can one do with a text like this? So why not find lexical sets here? So again, we are looking at the text as a linguistic object. We are not yet asking, have you ever been to Liverpool, which is a structure that they wouldn't know anyway. So one needs to be careful to just dive into a discussion about holiday experiences. Instead, we're focusing on the text as a linguistic object first. So find lexical sets, words for different places. So what do we have here? We have cathedral, art galleries, stadium, museum, old home, park, waterfront. So list of places, exactly as Helen was saying, list of places. Richard says you have them write a text about their homework for hometown, exactly. So that's a very interesting idea you mentioned, Richard, because that moves us from looking at the text as a linguistic object to the text as a springboard for production. So let's see whether this is something that also came to my mind. Ha! Great minds think alike, Richard. So, so I was also thinking, why not use this text and turn it into something different, maybe in a tourist advertisement. So we could use the language that we've already practiced in this text and tweak it a little bit, make it sound like an ad, maybe on the internet, presenting, I don't know, the latest sites of Liverpool, for example. Or, of course, you could write them to write an answer to Layla or Leon, right? Leon it is writing, right? So write an answer to Leon, or write an email to Leon in the name of Layla about a place you are at. Imagine you're on holiday, you're in Madrid, or you're in Berlin, or you're in Hamburg. Write an email about what you find there. You would use the same language structurally seen, so it is a great place to visit. There are cathedrals, places, towns, museums, pubs, restaurants. It is wonderful, it is great, it is interesting, it is old. So you'd recycle the language, however, you give students the chance to expand beyond the text that is being presented to them without diving into the area of discussing about the text, which might still stretch students' language capacity a bit too much. Yeah, write an answer to Leon, as Helen was saying, exactly. So that might be a thing to do with a text if you wanted to change the text or use it as a springboard for further text writing or discussion. If you have a group that likes going online, what I sometimes do, so we could add a box 6a, so to say, if we wanted to this slide, I sometimes use these texts for web quests. So I turn off my camera in online training and I ask students to go on the web, on the internet, for let's say 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depends, to find out more about Liverpool or about the Beatles Museum, if they like the Beatles. They'll then come back with all sorts of information they found on the internet. Now you might say, oh, come on, didn't you just say, at this level, one should be a bit careful about, new vocab and talking about things that might stretch their linguistic capacity? But then, on the other hand, isn't that what happens in real life? What you do is you go online and try to find out about the Beatles Museum in Liverpool, if you wanted to go there. I also encourage students to also do that in German, should they want to do, and then come back and present their findings in English. And they'd still be able to do that even at that level, because they'll find it interesting, they'll find it exciting and fascinating. It's their own knowledge that they've acquired, that they've found out about, and I assure you they'd be willing to look up these words for them. And that is saying, I think the task should be ones that students realistically might do in their real lives. Exactly. Yeah, rewriting into tourist ad might be good for travel agents or tour guides. Yeah, for example, yeah. So if you have students like these in class, or marketing people, for example, they love rewriting all sorts of text and getting their marketing stuff in that. I agree with you on that, absolutely. It shouldn't be something too cheesy or twisted, where students say, I would never ever really do that. So why should I write a text and something that doesn't come naturally to me? Absolutely agree with you. One needs to find a task that coaxes them into doing something that they like and find interesting. So maybe write another email, or write about their own town, for example. Or go with the research idea, as Nicole was saying. Okay, so far we've covered 6 things to do with the text. Now let's move on to something a bit more, let's say, complicated, if you want to say so. Well, should I say complicated, a bit more challenging maybe. Let's move away from Easy English Upgrade just for a second to Basis for Business B2. Some of you might be working with the book and might know this text about Derek Sivers. This is a B2 level text. And here we are moving into something that I would call authentic text reading. If you go into literature, you find tons of information about why authentic text reading is so beneficial to learners of English as a second language, or students of English as a second language. Because it's authentic language, because it's not cheesy, it's not forced or stilted. It's how people would really write and speak, and so on and so forth. All this is surely right. I agree. Helen has just found something out about Liverpool. Thank you very much, Helen. So all this is surely right. The idea of reading authentic text would surely appeal to B1, B2 learners. What is the disadvantage of that to A1, A2 learners? Well, the answer is obvious. Authentic texts are too difficult. Therefore, we need to tone down the difficulty in level, word order, lexis used, and so on and so forth. Something that we are able to keep, the high level, we are able to keep at a B1, B2 level. My experience is that in contrast to A1, A2 levels, B2 levels like being challenged. Whereas an A1 learner or an A 1.1 learner in particular might say, ooh, this is so difficult, I will never ever be able to learn that. A B2 learner might say, yes, this is something I can, sink my teeth into. This is something that I'd like to work on. Why is that? Because at this level, a B2 learner will be able to talk about why and what is difficult in the text in English, which an A1 learner will probably not be able to do. So here we are in the world of immersion, of paraphrasing in English. We're moving away from the translation approach that we discussed at the beginning in our theory part. We are here in the global reading area where people are able to handle also challenging and difficult stuff in English already. So therefore, I've chosen this text. This is a text I love also to use in case I have to step in, for a colleague of mine. So this is a lovely text. So if you have the book, I can only recommend going with this text for a standalone lesson about this entrepreneur. So what I do with a text like that? Actually, it's a text consisting of 2 texts. On the left-hand side, we have information presented about Derek Sivers. On the right-hand side, it's a text by him about why he gave away the company and why he gave away all the money he had earned from selling his company. He earned 22 million. He was a very successful entrepreneur. He sold his company and donated all the 22 million to a foundation. So why on earth did he do that? So what would you do with a text like this? Can I just get a few ideas in the chat? What would you do? I'm curious. I can see Susanne typing and Michelle. Discuss. Okay, so you would look at it as a text as a vehicle for information, right? Wolfgang saying. Split into two groups for each text half. So you would split it and discuss both areas. Your opinion. Split. Is what Richard's saying, Teresa's saying, discussing. Exactly. So I also have a feeling that very often when I read text with B2 students or C1 students, I tend to look at the text first and foremost as a vehicle for information because they like communication time, they like discussing things. What I sometimes feel I don't do, to be honest, and I have to admit, sharing the secret with you at the beginning of the webinar, that I often just, dish out text and hope that my students will prepare them for further discussion. I sometimes feel I don't dive too deeply into the language bit in the text, but also B2 level students can surely benefit from authentic texts, can take something on board, although they might already have the vocabulary to talk about this text without any problems. Still, there is much to be learned. There is more to be gained from authentic text. So what I do is I'll do what you do. I start with a BDA exercise. BDA is usually for me is before, during, and after. So before we dive into the text, I'll either have them discuss or invite them to discuss about the headline, as some of you mentioned in the text. So why I gave my company away to charity. It's a nice headline to discuss before you even read the text. Or you might go with the task given on the left-hand side. Entrepreneur Derek Sivers said that most people don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They buy others. They go with the flow, follow paths without making their own. What do you think motivates entrepreneurs? So discussion is exactly what you guys also listed in the chat. It's brilliant for discussion. Then I'll invite them to read the text below, either before, in preparation for next class, or during class. Since most of you said in the poll, people like reading text in class, so I stand corrected. I'll ask them to read it in class, give them maybe a minute or two, and then ask them a few comprehension questions just to make sure everybody got everything. Okay, and then have we dealt and done with that then? No, I think what else one could do, moving back from looking at this text only as a vehicle for information and discussion, one might also look at it as a linguistic object again. How to do that? What I found out, what my students really like, is when I ask them to come up with a new language themselves. What is a new language? I have to admit it's an idea that I shamelessly stolen from a colleague of mine, and you'll find his article also in the literature list in the handout. New language, or NNU, is new words and useful words. Why is that so interesting for students, or at least for my students? Because they suddenly found out that they are in charge of organizing and of handling the language that is being presented to them, in contrast to me saying, this is what you need to learn. This is an interesting linguistic form. This is a tense thing you should memorize. Instead, I'll ask them, okay, which words were new to you and which words would you put into your private dictionary or your notebook or Quizlet or whatever app you use to learn vocabulary, phase 6. What kind of language is useful to you? And to decide that means empowerment. And empowerment makes things interesting. Empowerment means I'm reading a text and I'm able to take whatever is useful out of it for me personally out of the text. And the rest I'll dump. And others might dump other things. It's for me to decide. It's my language development. And Claudia's saying, I collect these and new words on the blackboard. Yeah. When I meet the class again, we reconstruct the text with the help of these phrases. Thank you, Claudia, for sharing this. Brilliant idea. Yes. So I either ask the students to collect their words or we collect them all together. So you could turn that into collaborative effort and come up with a small lesson dictionary, so to say, or lesson glossary, new words, interesting words, words to be learned, words that are useful. You could ask them to create different contexts for the words that they come up with. So whatever empowers them to turn the text into a useful resource, into a treasure box, for new information, for fascinating new words to learn. That is something that my students, especially at a B2 level, B1, B2 level, like. Something that students at an A1, A2 level might struggle with, because they have to rely on you as teachers to tell them which words might be useful to learn and which they will probably have to learn to be able to communicate in English. And Michelle also agrees, great activity, especially for upper levels. So super, very nice. So these are 8 activities that I do with my students. Depending on what kind of platform you use, you could have them, of course, also highlight the things in the text, underline them. You could turn it into a very colorful picture if you have an interactive whiteboard or something like this. It doesn't have to be just writing things in the chat, but I'm sure you all use different platforms and you know best how to handle that, when teaching online. Okay, so we've covered 8 things to do. Looking at different texts and different perspectives, thinking of a text as either a vehicle for information, springboard activities, or as a linguistic object. Now, to wrap things up, my finding is that I now tend to think more about what level do I teach and what needs do I need to meet with students. And what I found is that at a higher level, I'm moving more now away from looking at the text only as a vehicle for information to more to a text also as a linguistic object, whereas at a lower level, I now tend to adapt my text a bit better, I feel, to students' needs, moving away from a text as a vehicle for information only, inviting people to discuss only, and then finding out that at the end of the discussion, I've actually overstretched their linguistic abilities. So these are my findings. And if you have anything to add to the chat to let us know how you deal with it, please do. The more the better, because we can only benefit from each other, I suppose. So thank you very much for being with us, and I'm sure Özlem will be with us in a second.